The Castle Raid of Cooley. The first half of this epic tale was discovered in an 11th century manuscript called the Book of the Dun Cow. The second half was found later in the 14th century in the manuscript called the Yellow Book of Lecan. However, the stories probably existed for hundreds and hundreds of years in oral form. Ireland was divided into provinces, and each one had its own king or queen who bowed to nobody except for the High King of Ireland who lived in Tara. In the most northern province of Ulster, a wealthy farmer once bragged to his wife, Macha, who was the fastest of the king's horses. When the king heard this, he told the farmer to prove it. Macha refused to race because she was heavily pregnant, but the king insisted, and Macha won the race, but fell to the ground on the finishing line and gave birth to twins. Afterwards, she put a curse on the men of Ulster that they would suffer terrible weakness in their time of greatest need. The rulers of Ulster, neighbouring province of Connacht, was a tall and fierce queen called Queen Maeve. One day she was arguing with her husband, Ailill, about which of the pair was the wealthiest. When they counted their possessions, they discovered they had exactly the same amount of land, jewellery, sheep and cattle, and in all the ways they were equal except one. Ailill owned a magnificent white bull, and Maeve, who was not used to defeat, sent her men the length and breadth of Ireland to search for a bull just as equal as her husband's, and they found such an animal in the Cooley Peninsula, which was in a part of Ulster. It was a brown bull, whose back was so broad that 50 children could play hurling on it. Maeve sent her messengers to Ulster to the bull's owner, Dare, asking for a loan of the animal for 1 year, and Dare agreed, and laid a feast for Maeve's men. While they were celebrating with mead and wine, Dare overheard one of them boasting that if the bull hadn't been given to them, they would have taken it by force. And unsurprisingly, Dare changed his mind about lending the bull to Maeve and sent the messengers back to Connacht empty-handed. Maeve was furious for being refused and gathered together the tribes of Connacht to go to war against Ulster for the bull. Now, luck was on Maeve's side because many years previously, a curse had been placed on the men of Ulster by Macha that they would suffer a terrible weakness in the time of their greatest need. This was their greatest need, and when the Ulstermen heard of Maeve's army gathering at the borders, the curse struck them down, turning their legs into liquid and inflicting horrible pains upon them. Women and children were immune, but every man was affected in Ulster, except one, the warrior Cuchulainn. He had the blood of the Tuatha Dé god Lu inside him, and he was not affected by Macha's curse. In his chariot, armed with only a spear and shield, Cuchulainn set off to defend Ulster while the men of Maeve were recovering from a great weakness. While Ulster's men were recovering from a great weakness. Maeve's army, only 5,000 strong. Only 5,000. Oh, only 5,000. Like, that's a small number. Cowered at the sight of a single warrior on the hill, with his dark hair and crimson cloak fluttering in the wind. They had heard stories about the Hound of Ulster, and they knew what they were facing was more than just one man. And if there were any doubts, the battle and fury would come upon Cuchulainn, and it was confirmed as much as expected that he was half man and half god. His face contorted in a golden light that burst from his head. Screaming, he charged towards Maeve's army and felled her men by the hundreds, cutting them down in his chariot, and then turning around and doing the same again. And again. And again. When enough damage had been done, Cuchulainn retreated to the narrow ford and challenged Maeve to send him her best champion each day to fight in single combat. Intent on occupying Ulster and retrieving the brown bull of Cooley, Maeve sent champion after champion to fight, but nobody capable of getting past the Hound of Cuchulainn, except maybe one man, Ferdia, Cuchulainn's old friend, who he had met at Scathach's training school. However, when all the champions were stepping forward to fight, Ferdia hung back. He did not want to fight his best friend and war lover. I might have just added that bit in there. Maeve hadn't asked him to fight because she knew he'd refuse. Now she begged him, offering him great herds of cattle, land, gold, and even the hand of her daughter in marriage, but he still refused. "You wouldn't like to be the next king of Connacht?" she asked. "Of course I would," said Ferdia. "But I won't fight Cuchulainn. He's like a brother to me, and we always promised to look out for each other." Maeve turned away. "If you're too scared to fight, that's fine." Now, one way to get any man to do what you want: bruise his ego. Ferdia was a proud warrior, and he called her back. Excuse me there, Queenie, come back here now and talk to me. I'm not scared of anyone or anything." "That's not what my soldiers say," said Maeve. "They say you're no match for Cuchulainn. They even say that the Hound of Ulster claims this himself." At this, Ferdia's blood boiled in anger, and he was agreeing to fight. "Nobody calls me a coward," he spat. And the next day the two men met in the ford, not in a violent clash, but in a firm embrace. See, war lovers. "It's good to see you, my old friend," said Cuchulainn. "Less of the old," laughed Ferdia, and then more solemnly said, "You know why I'm here." Cuchulainn nodded. "It will just be like when we were training at Scathach's. Except this time it's for real," said Ferdia. "As you are my guest," Cuchulainn said, "you may choose the weapons." Ferdia chose javelins. For the rest of the day the men hurled his weapons at each other. For each spear was either skillfully dodged or caught with the shield. By sundown, no wound had been inflicted, and that night the friends shared a meal and a laugh and told stories and slept under the stars. In the morning, Cuchulainn's weapon of choice was a broad-bladed spear, and for hours the men fought hand to hand, inflicting only minor wounds. At nightfall they tended to each other's wounds and slept on opposite banks of the river. And the next day, Cuchulainn thought Ferdia looked tired and offered him a chance to back out without dishonour. "I cannot look the men of Connacht in the eyes if I back down," he said, his voice lacking confidence. "Today I choose swords." The sound of iron on iron rang across the valley all day, but metal did little to cut flesh, and both men cried out in pain. But by nightfall, both were still standing. They returned to their camps, without speaking or tending to each other's wounds. And when Ferdia woke up the next morning, he knew that this was his final day. So he dressed in his best armour. He hung his large flat stone under the iron apron over his chest to protect him from Cuchulainn's belly spear, the Gael Bog, the weapon of which, fired with the foot, had been a gift to Cuchulainn from their old teacher Scathach, and Ferdia knew it never missed its mark. "Your choice of weapons today, Cuchulainn," said Ferdia, fixing the strap of his helmet. "Today, I choose all the weapons," said Cuchulainn. Ferdia's stomach flipped in fear as he knew that the Gael Bog was one of them. All morning they fought with spears, and by midday they changed to swords and shields, but neither warrior was any better. Panting with weariness, Cuchulainn lowered his shield to catch his breath. Ferdia saw his chance, thrust his sword forward, catching his opponent in the shoulder. Blood was spilling from the Hound of Cuchulainn, staggering backwards in his own side of the river, and he grabbed Scathach's belly spear. Using his foot, he hurled the weapon at Ferdia, who raised his bronze shield to block it, but it was no use. The Gael Bog flew straight through the shield and pierced Ferdia's iron armour, splitting the stone underneath in two. The spear went through Ferdia as well, emerging the other side of his body, wet and red. With a cry, he dropped his weapons, fell to his knees, and into the water. Cuchulainn caught him and dragged him to the riverbank, and with tears in his eyes he cradled his dying friend. "I am here, Ferdia, I am here." Ferdia gathered the last of his energy to speak. "You promised you would always be by my side right to the end, and here you are, my friend." Cuchulainn nodded, and one of his tears fell on his friend's face, and that was the last thing Ferdia ever felt. Meanwhile, the curse of the Great Weakness was wearing off the men of Ulster, and the King Conor mac Nessa rose to his feet, steadied himself with his sword, and yelled, "We must go to Cuchulainn's aid!" 5,000 men later, you know? It's like watching from the other side of the bank and just being like, "Yeah, we're over here if you need us, please don't. You got it, you look good." I'm pretty sure that's what happened, you know, like, all the men of Ulster were like, we don't really want to fight. How about everyone okay to say, you know, we're cursed and we've got jelly legs? Yeah, we all good? We all gonna agree on that? Yeah, no one tell Cuchulainn though, like, he can fight for us, right? He summoned every tribe of Ulster to march towards Maeve's army, and when Ferdia had been slain, Maeve knew that there was no man to match Cuchulainn. By the terms of their agreement, Maeve should have surrendered, but victory was more important than Maeve's honour. "If the hound wants me to send him champions," she thought, "then champions he shall have, all of them, at once." She climbed into her chariot, rode out into the front of her army. Raising her spear, she cried attack, and from the weary days of fighting, Cuchulainn was not afraid when he saw the Connacht army approach. He planted his feet firmly and raised his shield and was ready. As he braced himself for battle, the rumble of hoofs and chariots behind him came, and with a look he saw all the Ulster men, led by Conor mac Nessa, crest the hill, their banners rippling in the wind, their weapons reflecting in the sun. They tore down the hill to join Cuchulainn, and the two armies clashed in a mighty battle, which could be heard across all the provinces of Ireland. Conor mac Nessa's side seemed to be gaining the upper hand, and soon Maeve's army were on the retreat, and she knew she tried hard enough, but the tired troops were no match for Ulster's. But perhaps something could be salvaged from this disaster. She sent a small band of men away from the battle to the Cooley Peninsula. With all the Ulster men turned out to fight, she said, the brown bull of Cooley could be lightly guarded. And how right she was, and in the chaos nobody spotted a small group of men cross the Ulster border, grab the biggest bull, and come back to Connacht. As Maeve's army was retreating, a small group of men dragged the brown bull of Cooley out of Ulster's ropes. The thieves took a different route home to avoid Conor mac Nessa's soldiers, who had successfully driven Maeve's army away. Back in Connacht's palace, Maeve licked her wounds in defeat, but cheered at the sight of the gigantic brown bull hauling and kicking and snorting in her paddocks. "Don't put him in there," she shouted to the men. "Put him with my husband's white bull, so that he can see just how I've won this argument." Ailill was brought out to watch the giant brown bull being pushed into the enclosure with his bull. "Happy now?" said Maeve. "Happy? I'm not," replied Ailill, "for I cannot believe that my wife would go to war for the sake of a bloody bull. To win an argument, I cannot believe my wife would spill so much blood of Connacht men for this prize." He pointed at the brown bull, now released from its bonds, and Maeve hung her head in shame, but unfortunately, the bloodshed was not over. For the field of the two bulls eyed each other, and warily on opposite sides of the paddock, they pawed the ground, snorted disapprovingly, and simultaneously lowered their heads, horns pointed at each other, charged, and killed each other. The animals matched in strength and size, and they were now dead. "Happy now?" said Ailill to his wife in disgust, turned away, and walked away from his wife. The end.